Amidst the Ruins.
France, 1918.
Isabel Hartley stood at Lieutenant Samuel Hayes' grave, whispering a quiet farewell. Then, as the wind picked up, she heard a voice, so soft she almost missed it.
Not yet. She spun around.
The graveyard was empty, but the soil beneath her feet felt freshly disturbed. Chapter 1. A Whisper in the Wind. The wind, a mournful, keening thing, whipped across the bleak expanse of the military cemetery, tugging at the edges of Isabel Hartley's black mourning veil. Rain, a constant companion in this ravaged corner of France, threatened again, the bruised sky hanging low and heavy over the rows of stark white crosses. 1918, the year the world bled. And Isabel, it seemed, bled with it. Her gloved hand, trembling slightly, traced the freshly carved inscription on the cross before her. Lieutenant Samuel Hayes.
Brevet de sang.
A hero of the Empire.
Lies.
All lies. Samuel, her Samuel, had been no hero in the jingoistic sense. He'd been a poet trapped in a soldier's uniform, a gentle soul forced to witness and participate in unimaginable horrors. He'd written to her of the mud, the blood, the rats, the constant, gnawing fear. He'd written of his longing for home, for the scent of her lavender soap, for the quiet evenings spent reading by the fire. Isabel closed her eyes, the phantom scent of lavender momentarily overcoming the pervasive stench of damp earth and distant cordite. She could almost feel his arms around her, his whispered promises echoing in the hollow chambers of her heart. Promises broken like so many fragile things in this war. Samuel, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rising wind. My dear Samuel, I don't know how to go on without you. The official telegram had arrived 3 weeks prior, crisp and impersonal, informing her of his death in action. A hero's death, it claimed, killed while leading his men in a daring charge. But Isabel knew better. She'd received a letter from him, smuggled out by a sympathetic nurse, just days before the telegram. A letter filled with a desperate plea for her to understand, to forgive him for a choice he'd been forced to make. A choice that had, ultimately, cost him his life. But the letter had ended abruptly, unfinished, leaving her with a gnawing sense of unease and 1,000 unanswered questions. The wind intensified, swirling around her like a restless spirit. And then she heard it. A voice, so faint, so fleeting, that she almost dismissed it as a trick of the wind, a figment of her grief-stricken imagination. Not yet. Isabel's head snapped up. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She spun around, her gaze sweeping across the deserted cemetery. Rows and rows of crosses, stretching as far as the eye could see, stood silent sentinel under the weeping sky. There was no one, just the wind, the rain, and the ghosts of the fallen. Who's there? She called out, her voice trembling. Silence. Only the relentless whisper of the wind through the long grass. She must be imagining things. Grief did strange things to the mind, she knew. She'd heard stories of women seeing their dead husbands, their lost sons, walking among the living. Hallucinations, born of despair. And yet Isabel's gaze fell to the earth at the foot of Samuel's cross. The soil, unlike the neatly packed earth around the other graves, appeared loose, disturbed. As if someone or something had recently been digging there. A fresh wave of unease washed over her. This wasn't the work of gravediggers. Their work was meticulous, respectful. This looked frantic, desperate. She knelt, her black skirt pooling in the damp earth, and reached out a hesitant hand. The soil was cold, clinging to her glove like a shroud. She brushed away a layer, her fingers encountering something hard, unyielding. A small, wooden box, crudely made, was buried just beneath the surface. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't a hallucination. This was real. Someone had buried something here, something they didn't want found. And that voice, not yet. Not yet what? Isabel hesitated, her mind reeling. Should she open it? Was it a trap? A cruel joke? Or could it be a message from Samuel? A final, desperate attempt to communicate with her from beyond the grave? The wind howled, a mournful cry that seemed to echo her own inner turmoil. The rain began to fall, fat, cold drops splattering on the wooden box, on her hands, on Samuel's grave. The sky wept, and Isabel, torn between fear and a desperate, flickering hope, made her decision. She pried open the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of damp earth, was a single, mud-stained envelope. Her name was scrawled across the front in Samuel's familiar, elegant handwriting. A letter he'd somehow managed to have buried with him. A letter that had whispered to be read.
But not yet. But why?
Chapter 2. The Disturbed Earth. Her fingers, numb with cold and a burgeoning sense of dread, fumbled with the sealed flap of the envelope. The paper, damp and fragile, threatened to tear at the slightest pressure. Isabel drew a shaky breath, the scent of wet earth and something faintly metallic filling her nostrils. The metallic tang, she realized with a sickening lurch, was the lingering scent of blood. The envelope was stained, a dark, rust-colored blotch marring Samuel's elegant script. Finally, the seal gave way. Inside, a single sheet of paper, folded multiple times, was nestled within. Isabel unfolded it carefully, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The handwriting was unmistakably Samuel's, though it was more hurried, more frantic than his usual meticulous script. The ink was smudged in places, as if he'd written it in haste, perhaps in the dark. My dearest Isabel, if you are reading this, then I am gone. And the official story, the one they will tell you, is a lie. I did not die a hero. I died a coward, perhaps. Or perhaps something worse. I cannot tell you everything, not here, not now. It is too dangerous. But I need you to know, to understand, that I did what I did for us. For our future. For the hope of a life together, a life free from the shadow of this infernal war. Isabel's breath hitched. Coward? Samuel? Never. He might have been a poet, a dreamer, but he was the bravest man she knew. He'd faced the horrors of the trenches with a quiet courage that had always astounded her. What could he possibly have done that he considered cowardly? There is a man, a Captain Moreau. He is not what he seems. He is dangerous. He knows the truth about what happened. He may try to contact you. Do not trust him, Isabel. No matter what he says. He will try to manipulate you, to use you. He is a serpent, coiled and waiting to strike. Captain Moreau. The name was unfamiliar, a chilling whisper in the silence of the graveyard. Isabel reread the passage, her mind racing. What truth? What had happened? Samuel's words were cryptic, veiled in secrecy, but the underlying tone of fear and desperation was unmistakable. I have hidden something that will explain everything. It is in the place where we first met. The old oak tree, by the river. Remember the hollow, where we carved our initials. It is there. But be careful, Isabel. Be very careful. They're watching. They're always watching. The old oak tree. Their tree. A wave of bittersweet memories washed over Isabel. It was where they had first confessed their love, where they had spent countless hours dreaming of a future that now seemed impossibly distant. It was a place of sanctuary, of peace, a world away from the carnage and the bloodshed. I love you, Isabel. I have always loved you, and I will always love you, even from beyond the grave. Please find the truth. For me. For us. And for the sake of the letter ended abruptly, the sentence unfinished, the ink trailing off into a jagged line, as if he'd been interrupted, or worse. Isabel stared at the incomplete sentence, her heart aching with a grief so profound, so overwhelming, that it threatened to consume her. The rain was falling harder now, a steady downpour that blurred the words on the page, mingling with her tears. She clutched the letter to her chest, her body shaking with sobs. Samuel was gone. But he'd left her a task, a mission. To find the truth. To uncover the secrets that had led to his death. And to expose the serpent, Captain Moreau. She had no idea what she was looking for, or what dangers lay ahead. But she knew one thing. She would not rest until she had fulfilled Samuel's final wish. She owed him that much. She owed him everything. She carefully refolded the letter, tucking it into the inner pocket of her coat, close to her heart. The wooden box, empty now, felt strangely significant. She couldn't just leave it there. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the rough edges. It was a tangible link to Samuel, a reminder of his love, his courage, and his desperate plea for help. Isabel rose to her feet, her legs stiff and aching. The graveyard, shrouded in mist and rain, seemed to press in on her, the silent crosses like accusing eyes. She had to leave. She had to get to the old oak tree. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that unseen eyes were following her every move. As she turned to go, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A single, fresh red rose lay at the foot of Samuel's grave, its petals glistening with raindrops. It hadn't been there before. Someone had placed it there after she had arrived. A sign? A warning? Or a message from the serpent himself? A cold shiver ran down her spine. The game, whatever it was, had begun. And she was already playing catch-up. The feeling that she wouldn't be walking out alone clung heavily to her as she glanced back, once more, at the rose, now almost bowing under the rain. Chapter 3. Echoes of the Fallen. The journey back to her small cottage felt longer, heavier than usual. The rain, unrelenting, soaked through her coat, chilling her to the bone. Every shadow seemed to lengthen, to twist into menacing shapes. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound, sent a jolt of fear through her. Samuel's words, "They are watching. They are always watching," echoed in her mind, a constant, unsettling refrain. She lived on the outskirts of a small village, nestled in a valley that had, so far, escaped the worst of the war's ravages. But even here, the war's presence was inescapable. The constant rumble of distant artillery, the occasional sight of wounded soldiers being transported to the nearby field hospital, the somber faces of the villagers, all served as a constant reminder of the brutal conflict raging just beyond the horizon. Her cottage, a small, two-story structure with whitewashed walls and a thatched roof, had always been her sanctuary, a place of peace and tranquility. But tonight it felt different. Cold, empty, haunted by the ghost of Samuel's absence. She lit a fire in the hearth, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. The warmth, though welcome, did little to dispel the chill that had settled deep within her bones. She changed into dry clothes, her movements slow and deliberate, her mind still grappling with the contents of Samuel's letter. Captain Morrow, the old oak tree, the hidden something, the unfinished sentence. The pieces of the puzzle swirled in her mind, a chaotic jumble of fear, suspicion, and desperate hope. She made herself a cup of weak tea, the familiar ritual a small comfort in the face of the overwhelming uncertainty. As she sat by the fire, sipping the tea, her gaze fell upon a small, framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It was a picture of her and Samuel, taken just before he'd left for the front. They were standing beneath the old oak tree, their arms around each other, their faces radiant with love and hope. Isabel picked up the photograph, her fingers tracing the contours of Samuel's face. He looked so young, so carefree, so untouched by the horrors that awaited him. A fresh wave of grief washed over her, the pain almost unbearable. She remembered that day, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the gentle breeze rustling through the leaves of the oak tree, the sound of the river flowing nearby. They had carved their initials into the trunk of the tree, a symbol of their enduring love, a promise of forever. S.I. forever. A hollow, she had written. The hollow where they'd hidden small trinkets, love notes, secrets shared only between them. That's where Samuel had hidden whatever it was he wanted her to find. But what was it? A letter? A document? A weapon? Her imagination ran wild, fueled by fear and the cryptic nature of Samuel's message. She knew she couldn't go there tonight. It was too dark, too dangerous. And the feeling of being watched persisted, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck. She would have to wait until morning. But sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and restless. Her dreams were filled with images of war, of trenches and gunfire, of Samuel's face, pale and lifeless, staring up at her from the bottom of a muddy grave. She saw the red rose, its petals dripping with blood, and the shadowy figure of Captain Moreau, his face obscured by darkness, his voice a menacing whisper. She awoke with a start, her heart pounding, her body drenched in sweat. The first rays of dawn were filtering through the curtains, painting the room in a pale, ethereal light. The rain had stopped, and the world outside was eerily silent, as if holding its breath. Isabel rose from bed, her limbs heavy with exhaustion. She dressed quickly, her movements driven by a sense of urgency, a need to get to the oak tree, to uncover the truth, before it was too late. As she was about to leave, she noticed something on the small table by the door. A single, white feather lay there, its delicate barbs ruffled, as if it had been dropped in haste. It hadn't been there last night. Her blood ran cold. Someone had been in her cottage. While she slept, the feather, she realized, was from a dove. A symbol of peace. Or a message from someone claiming to be a friend. Another player in this dangerous game? Or a different warning from the same shadowy figure. She placed the feather within the folds of Samuel's letter, a shiver of unease working down her spine. Isabel stepped out into the crisp morning air, the world around her bathed in the soft, golden light of dawn. The silence, however, was deceptive. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that she was not alone. She was being watched, and the game had well and truly begun. She would have to tread carefully, starting with her first steps toward the river. Chapter 4. The Serpent in the Sanctuary. The path to the river wound through a small wood, the trees still dripping from the night's rain. The air was fresh and clean, scented with the fragrance of damp earth and pine needles. But the beauty of the morning did little to soothe Isabel's frayed nerves. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of fear through her. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see the shadowy figure of Captain Moreau, or one of his henchmen, lurking among the trees. She reached the riverbank, the familiar sight of the old oak tree bringing a momentary pang of bittersweet nostalgia. It stood on a small rise overlooking the water, its massive branches reaching out like gnarled arms, its leaves of vibrant green against the pale blue sky. This place, once a sanctuary of love and laughter, now felt ominous, fraught with hidden dangers. Isabel approached the tree cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. She ran her hand over the rough bark, her fingers tracing the familiar carving, S.I. forever. The letters, weathered and worn, were still clearly visible, a testament to a love that had endured the ravages of time and war.
Or so she believed.
She remembered the day they had carved those initials, the warmth of Samuel's hand in hers, the promise in his eyes. A promise that had been shattered, like so many fragile things in this brutal world. She located the hollow, a small cavity in the trunk of the tree, hidden beneath a tangle of ivy. It was just large enough to conceal a small object. Her hand trembled as she reached inside, her fingers brushing against something cold and hard. She pulled it out. It was a small, metal box, intricately engraved with a pattern of leaves and vines. It was locked, a tiny padlock securing its contents. Isabel's heart sank. She didn't have the key. Frustration and despair welled up inside her. She had come so far, risked so much, only to be thwarted by a locked box. Had Samuel hidden the key somewhere else? Or had it been taken by whom? Captain Moreau? The Watchers? She sat down heavily at the base of the tree, the metal box clutched in her hands. She felt utterly defeated, overwhelmed by the enormity of the task ahead of her. She didn't know who to trust, who to turn to for help. Isabel? The voice, deep and resonant, startled her. She jumped to her feet, spinning around to face the speaker. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, his figure silhouetted against the morning sun. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the uniform of a British officer. A captain's insignia glinted on his shoulder. Captain Moreau. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a firm, determined jaw. He wasn't conventionally handsome, but there was a certain charisma about him, a sense of power and authority that was both intriguing and unsettling. "Captain Moreau?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He smiled, a slow, calculated smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Indeed, Miss Hartley. I've been expecting you." "Expecting me?" Isabel's grip tightened on the metal box. Samuel's warning echoed in her mind. "Do not trust him, Isabel. He is a serpent, coiled and waiting to strike." "Lieutenant Hayes spoke of you often," Moreau said, his voice smooth and persuasive. "He considered you a very dear friend." "He was more than a friend," Isabel replied, her voice laced with defiance.
"He was my fiancé."
Moreau's smile widened slightly.
"Ah, yes. Forgive me."
"I was not aware of the depth of your relationship." He paused, his gaze shifting to the metal box in her hands. "I see you found it." "Found what?" Isabel asked, feigning ignorance. "This old box? I found it here, by the tree. I don't know what it is." Moreau's eyes narrowed slightly, his expression hardening. "Don't play games with me, Miss Hartley. I know what that box contains. And I know that Lieutenant Hayes entrusted it to you." "I don't know what you're talking about," Isabel insisted, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had to be careful. She had to play along, at least for now, until she could figure out what Moreau wanted and how to protect herself. "Very well," Moreau said, his voice taking on a steely edge. "Let's just say that Lieutenant Hayes was involved in a delicate matter. A matter of national security. And that box contains information that is vital to the war effort." "Information?" Isabel repeated, her mind racing. "What kind of information?" Moreau stepped closer, his presence looming over her. "Information that could cost many lives if it fell into the wrong hands," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Information that you, Miss Hartley, are now in possession of. And what do you intend to do about it?" she challenged, even though her voice quivered slightly with the lie. He smiled again, that same unsettling smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "I intend to retrieve it, Miss Hartley, for the good of the Empire. And for your own safety, of course." His eyes flicked to the locked box, then back up. "Give it to me now, and this can all be done easily." The words hung in the quiet morning air, a silent ultimatum between a grieving woman and a man who claimed to be her ally. But all Isabel heard was the echo of Samuel's warning. The serpent was now face to face with her, and his fangs were bared. Chapter 5. Letters from a Ghost. Isabel's mind raced. She was trapped. Moreau was clearly not going to leave without the box, and she had no way of knowing what it contained or what dangers it held. To hand it over blindly would be to betray Samuel's trust, to potentially play right into the hands of the enemy, whoever that might be. But to refuse, that could be even more dangerous. She needed time. Time to think, to plan, to find a way out of this impossible situation. "Captain," she said, forcing a calmness she didn't feel into her voice, "I understand your concern. But as I said, I don't know what this box contains. Lieutenant Hayes, he never told me anything about this delicate matter." Moreau's eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing. "Don't insult my intelligence, Miss Hartley. Lieutenant Hayes was a meticulous man. He wouldn't have entrusted something this important to you without explaining its significance." "Perhaps he intended to," Isabel countered, "but he died before he had the chance." She let a hint of genuine grief creep into her voice, hoping to play on any shred of sympathy Moreau might possess. "I found a letter buried with him. It mentioned this box and this place. But that's all I know." Moreau's expression softened slightly, a flicker of something that might have been compassion crossing his face. Or perhaps it was just a clever tactic, another layer of deception. "A letter?" he asked, his voice losing some of its steely edge. "May I see it?" Isabel hesitated. The letter was her only link to Samuel, her only guide in this treacherous labyrinth. To show it to Moreau would be to reveal her hand, to give him a crucial advantage. But she had no choice. She needed to buy herself time, and the letter was her only bargaining chip. She reached into her coat pocket and carefully withdrew the mud-stained envelope, the dove feather still tucked safely within. She handed it to Moreau, her hand trembling slightly. Moreau took the envelope, his fingers brushing against hers. A jolt of electricity, a mixture of fear and something else, shot through her. She quickly pulled her hand away. He opened the envelope and extracted the letter, his eyes scanning the hurried script. Isabel watched him closely, trying to gauge his reaction, to decipher any clues from his expression. His face remained impassive, a mask of professional detachment. But she noticed a slight tightening of his jaw, a subtle flicker of his eyes, as he read certain passages. He finished reading and looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "This letter, it's incomplete." "Yes," Isabel replied, her voice barely a whisper. It ended abruptly, as if he was interrupted. Or as if he was running out of time, Moreau added, his gaze intense. "He mentions me, you know." "Yes," Isabel said, her heart pounding.
"He warned me about you."
Moreau smiled, a humorless smile that sent a chill down her spine.
"Did he now? And what did he say?"
"He said you were dangerous," Isabel replied, her voice gaining strength. "That you were not what you seemed. That I shouldn't trust you." Moreau chuckled softly. Lieutenant Hayes was a troubled man, Miss Hartley. He was suffering from shell shock, you see. His judgment was impaired. "I don't believe you," Isabel said, her voice firm. "Samuel was not insane. He was scared. And he was trying to protect me." "Protect you from what?" Moreau asked, his voice softening again. "From the truth?" "From you," Isabel retorted, her eyes flashing with anger. "From whatever game you're playing." Moreau stepped closer, his presence looming over her again. "I'm not playing a game, Miss Hartley. I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to protect you. But you have to cooperate. You have to give me the box." Isabel took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching for the small pocket knife she always carried with her. It was a pathetic weapon against a trained soldier, but it was all she had. "I need to know what's inside," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I need to know why Samuel wanted me to have it." Moreau sighed, a hint of impatience in his voice. "There's no time for explanations, Miss Hartley. We need to get that box to safety before it's too late." "Too late for whom?" Isabel challenged. "For you? Or for the Empire?" Moreau's eyes narrowed again, his expression hardening. "You're playing a dangerous game, Miss Hartley. A game you cannot win." He reached out, his hand closing around her wrist. His grip was strong, painful. Isabel gasped, struggling to free herself. "Let go of me," she cried. He tightened his grip, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Give me the box, Miss Hartley, or I will be forced to take it from you." Just as she thought he might overpower her, a twig snapped nearby. Both of their heads whipped around, and Moreau released his grip, taking a defensive step back. A figure emerged from the trees, a young woman, dressed in the simple garb of a local villager. She was carrying a basket, filled with what looked like wild herbs and flowers. She stopped, her eyes wide with surprise and fear. "Mademoiselle Hartley?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Is everything all right?" The interruption, however unexpected, had broken the tension. Isabel saw a flicker of something in Moreau's eyes, a calculation. He knew he couldn't use force now, not with a witness. "Everything is fine, Marie," Isabel said, forcing a smile. Captain Moreau was just leaving. Moreau hesitated for a moment, his gaze shifting between Isabel and the young woman. Then he gave a curt nod. "Very well, Miss Hartley," he said, his voice smooth again. "I will leave you to your foraging. But we will continue this conversation later. Be assured of that." He turned and strode away, disappearing into the trees. Isabel watched him go, her heart still pounding, her body trembling with adrenaline. The young woman, Marie, approached her cautiously. "Are you sure you're all right, Mademoiselle Hartley?" That man, he looked angry. "I'm fine, Marie," Isabel said, trying to regain her composure. "Thank you for coming along." Marie nodded, her eyes still filled with concern. "I often come here to gather herbs," she said. It's a peaceful place.
Usually.
Yes, Isabel said, her gaze returning to the old oak tree. Usually. She knew she couldn't stay here.
Moreau would be back.
And next time he might not be alone. Or so easily deterred. She had to find the key to the box, and she had to do it quickly. Before Moreau found her again. She looked at Marie. Perhaps an unlikely ally had just presented herself. But could she be trusted? Chapter 6. The Secret of the Psalm. Isabel watched Marie carefully as the young woman arranged the herbs in her basket. She was petite, with dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, and wide, innocent eyes that seemed to reflect the quiet beauty of the surrounding countryside. But beneath that gentle exterior, Isabel sensed a certain resilience, a strength born of living in a war-torn land. Could she be an ally? Or was she another piece in Moreau's elaborate game? Marie, Isabel began, choosing her words carefully. You said you come here often? Marie nodded.
Oui, mademoiselle.
Since I was a little girl. My grandmother taught me about the herbs, the flowers, the secrets of the forest. Secrets. The word resonated with Isabel. Perhaps Marie knew more about this place, about the oak tree, than she let on. Did you ever know Lieutenant Hayes? Isabel asked, holding her breath. Marie's eyes clouded with sadness. The English soldier? I saw him sometimes. He and you. You would come here to the tree. You seemed very happy. We were, Isabel said, her voice choked with emotion. Very happy. A silence fell between them, broken only by the gentle murmur of the river. Isabel studied Marie's face, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of ulterior motive. But she saw only genuine sympathy, a shared grief for a life lost too soon. He was a good man, Marie said softly. He was kind to the villagers. He even helped my brother when he was injured. Isabel's heart skipped a beat. This was a side of Samuel she hadn't known. His letters had focused on the horrors of the war, the constant fear and despair. He hadn't mentioned his acts of kindness, his compassion for the local people. Your brother? Isabel asked. What happened? Marie's face darkened. He was caught in a crossfire near the Somme. A shell exploded nearby. He was badly wounded. The Somme. The name sent a shiver down Isabel's spine. It was synonymous with death, with unimaginable carnage. It was where Samuel had died. Or so she'd been told. Samuel, he helped him? Isabel prompted. Marie nodded.
Oui.
He carried him to the field hospital. He stayed with him until the doctors arrived. He saved his life. Isabel felt a surge of pride, mingled with a renewed sense of loss. Samuel, her gentle, poetic Samuel, had been a hero after all. But not in the way the official reports had claimed. His heroism had been quiet, unassuming, born of compassion, not of blind obedience. Marie, Isabel said, a sudden thought striking her. Did he ever give you anything? A message? A box, perhaps? Marie's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. A box?
Non, mademoiselle.
He gave me nothing. Isabel's heart sank. Another dead end. But then, Marie hesitated, her brow furrowed in thought. He did give me something once, she said slowly. But it was not a box. It was a key.
A key.
Isabel's pulse quickened. Could it be? A key? She repeated, her voice trembling with anticipation. What kind of key? A small key, Marie replied. A very old key. He said it was important. That I should keep it safe. He said if anything ever happened to him, I was too. I do not know what he was about to tell me when some soldiers approached, calling him. Where is it? Isabel asked, her voice urgent. Do you still have it? Marie nodded.
Oui.
I keep it with my grandmother's rosary. It is a special keepsake. Marie, Isabel said, her voice pleading, I need that key. It's the key to this box. She held up the metal box, her hand trembling. It belonged to Samuel. It contained something important. Something that could explain his death. Marie's eyes widened in understanding. You think he was murdered? Isabel hesitated. She didn't want to frighten Marie, but she needed her help. I don't know, she said honestly. But I need to find out. And that key, it could be the answer. Marie looked at the box, then at Isabel, her expression torn. She was clearly hesitant, reluctant to part with her keepsake. But she also saw the desperation in Isabel's eyes, the grief that etched her face. "Come with me," Marie said finally, her voice resolute. "I will get the key." They walked back through the wood, Marie leading the way, her movements swift and sure. Isabel followed close behind, her mind racing with anticipation. They reached Marie's cottage, a small, stone structure nestled among a cluster of other houses. It was simple, but well kept, with a small garden filled with flowers and herbs. Marie led her inside, the air thick with a scent of dried herbs and wood smoke. An elderly woman, Marie's grandmother, sat by the fire, her wrinkled hands busy with a piece of knitting. She looked up as they entered. Her eyes, though aged, were sharp and intelligent. Marie spoke to her grandmother in rapid French, explaining the situation. The old woman listened intently, her gaze shifting between Marie and Isabel. She nodded slowly, her expression grave. Marie went to a small wooden chest in the corner of the room and opened it. She rummaged inside for a moment, then pulled out a small, velvet pouch. She opened the pouch and carefully extracted a small, ornate key. It was old, its metal tarnished with age, but it was beautifully crafted, its handle shaped like a tiny bird. Isabel's heart leaped. It was the key. She was sure of it. Marie handed her the key, her hand trembling slightly. "Be careful, Mademoiselle Hartley," she said. "This key, it may open more than just a box." Isabel nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, Marie," she said. "Thank you for everything." She tucked the key securely into her pocket. She knew, with a certainty that sent a shiver of both fear and excitement down her spine, what she had to do. She had to return to the tree. Alone. Chapter 7. Beneath a Sky of Ashes. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the fields. The sky, once a vibrant blue, was now streaked with hues of orange, purple, and a bruised, unsettling gray. It was a sky that mirrored the turmoil within Isabel, a blend of hope and fear, determination and despair. The air, heavy with the scent of approaching rain, felt thick and oppressive, making each breath a conscious effort. She walked back to the oak tree with a purposeful stride, trying to ignore the prickling sensation at the back of her neck, the feeling of being watched that had become her constant companion. She clutched the small key in her pocket, its cold metal a tangible reminder of the task ahead. The oak tree stood silhouetted against the fading light, its branches reaching out like the arms of a grieving giant. The river murmured nearby, its gentle sound a stark contrast to the pounding of her heart. Isabel approached the hollow, her movements slow and deliberate. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing pulse. This was it. The moment of truth. She inserted the key into the padlock on the metal box. It fit perfectly. A small click echoed in the silence as the lock sprang open. Isabel hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the lid of the box. What would she find inside? The truth about Samuel's death? A dangerous secret? Or something else entirely? She lifted the lid. The box was lined with soft velvet, now faded and worn. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton wool, lay a single, leather-bound journal. And beneath it, a folded map. Isabel carefully lifted the journal, her fingers tracing the embossed initials on the cover. S.H. Samuel's Journal. Her heart ached with a mixture of grief and anticipation. She opened the journal, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. The first few pages were filled with Samuel's poetry, his reflections on life, on love, on the beauty of the natural world. His words, even in this context, were filled with a gentle grace, a sensitivity that had always drawn her to him. But as she turned the pages, the tone of the journal began to change. The poetry gave way to observations, to accounts of his experiences in the trenches. He wrote of the horrors he had witnessed, the constant fear, the senseless loss of life. He wrote of his growing disillusionment with the war, with the propaganda, with the lies that were being fed to the public. And then she found it. The entry that changed everything. July 12th, 1918 today, I discovered something terrible. Something that could shake the very foundations of this war. Captain Moreau, he is not what he seems. He is involved in something far more sinister than I ever imagined. He is dealing with the enemy. Selling secrets. Betraying his own men. Isabel's blood ran cold. Samuel's warning had been true. Moreau was a traitor. But what secrets had he been selling? And to whom? She continued reading, her eyes racing across the page. I have evidence. Documents. Letters. Proof of his treachery. I have hidden them, along with this journal, in a place where they will be safe. If anything happens to me, I need someone to find them. Someone I can trust. Someone who will expose Moreau and his collaborators. Isabel. My dearest Isabel. If you are reading this, then I am gone. And you're in danger. Moreau will come for you. He will try to silence you. You must be strong. You must be brave. You must find the truth. And you must expose him. For the sake of all those who have died, for the sake of our future, for the sake of the entry ended abruptly, unfinished, just like the letter she had found in his grave. Isabel closed the journal, her hands trembling. The weight of Samuel's words, the enormity of his discovery, pressed down on her. She was holding evidence of high treason, evidence that could change the course of the war. But she was also holding a death warrant. Moreau would stop at nothing to get his hands on this journal, on the documents Samuel had mentioned. She lifted the journal and saw again the map. She unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the intricate details. It was a map of the local area, marked with various locations, including the village, the field hospital, and the Somme. A specific section of the Somme was circled in red ink, with a small X marking a precise spot. The X was located near where Samuel had died. A chilling realization washed over Isabel. The documents, the proof of Moreau's treachery, were not hidden here, in the oak tree. They were hidden at the Somme, in the very heart of the battlefield. She had to go there. She had to retrieve those documents, to expose Moreau and his conspiracy. But how? It was a suicide mission. A lone woman, venturing into the most dangerous place on earth. But she had no choice. She had made a promise to Samuel. A promise she intended to keep, no matter the cost. As she refolded the map, a glint of metal caught her eye. Tucked into the fold was a small, silver locket. She recognized it instantly. It was Samuel's. He had always worn it, a picture of her inside. She opened the locket, her fingers trembling. The picture was still there, her smiling face looking back at her, a poignant reminder of a happier time. But there was something else in the locket, tucked behind the picture. A small, folded piece of paper. She carefully unfolded it. It was a single sentence, written in Samuel's hand. Trust no one but the raven. The raven. Another cryptic clue. Another piece of the puzzle. Who or what was the raven? And how could she find it? The sky above her was now completely dark, a vast expanse of blackness punctuated by the faint glimmer of stars. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, splattering on the leaves of the oak tree. She felt more alone than ever, as she looked up at the sky. Chapter 8. The Wounded Heart of a Soldier. The rain intensified, mirroring the storm raging within Isabel. She sought shelter beneath the dense canopy of the oak tree, the journal and the map clutched tightly in her hands. The locket, with its cryptic message, felt warm against her skin. Trust no one but the raven. The words echoed in her mind, a riddle wrapped in a mystery, shrouded in the dangers of a war-torn world. She needed to get back to the cottage, to a place where she could think, where she could examine the journal and the map more closely. But the journey back felt fraught with peril. Moreau was out there, somewhere waiting, watching. She decided to take a different route, a longer, more circuitous path that avoided the main road. She moved quickly, silently, through the darkened fields, the rain plastering her clothes to her body, the wind whipping at her hair. She reached the cottage, breathless and soaked to the bone, but relieved to be back within its familiar walls. She bolted the door, lit a fire, and changed into dry clothes. The warmth of the fire slowly began to thaw her chilled limbs, but it did little to ease the turmoil in her mind. She spread the map out on the table, her eyes scanning the intricate details. The X, marking the location of the hidden documents, was precise, but it was in the middle of nowhere, a desolate stretch of land near the front lines. Getting there would be incredibly dangerous, almost impossible. She opened the journal again, searching for any further clues, any hints that might help her. She reread Samuel's entries about Moreau, about his suspicions, about his growing fear. She found detailed descriptions of Moreau's movements, his meetings with suspicious individuals, his coded messages. Samuel had been meticulous in his investigation, gathering evidence with the precision of a seasoned detective. But he hadn't identified his contact, the person he referred to as the Raven. Isabel closed her eyes, trying to picture Samuel, sitting in his tent, writing in his journal, risking his life to expose a traitor. She felt a surge of admiration for his courage, his unwavering commitment to truth and justice. A sudden knock on the door startled her. She jumped to her feet, her heart pounding. Who could it be? Moreau? Had he found her already? She grabbed the poker from beside the fireplace, her hand trembling. She crept to the door, her ear pressed against the wood. Isabel? It's me, Thomas.
Thomas.
Relief washed over her, weakening her knees. Thomas was the village doctor, a kind, elderly man who had treated her and Samuel on several occasions. He was a trusted friend, one of the few people she felt she could confide in. But could she trust him completely? Samuel's words, "trust no one," echoed in her mind. She hesitated for a moment, then unbolted the door. Thomas stood on the doorstep, his face etched with concern. He was drenched, his coat soaked through, his hair plastered to his forehead. "Isabel, thank God you're all right," he said, his voice filled with relief.
I saw Moreau heading this way.
"I was worried."
Moreau?
Isabel asked, her heart skipping a beat. "He was here?" "Yes," Thomas replied.
He was asking about you.
He said he was concerned for your safety." Isabel's grip tightened on the poker. Moreau's lies were becoming more elaborate, more insidious. "Come in, Thomas," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "You're soaked." Thomas entered the cottage, shaking his head. "It's a terrible night," he said. "The war, it just goes on and on." He noticed the journal and the map on the table. His eyes widened slightly. "What's this?" he asked. Isabel hesitated. Could she trust him? She had to trust someone. And Thomas had always been a good friend, a source of comfort and support. "It's Samuel's journal," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And a map. He left them for me." Thomas's expression turned grave. "Samuel? But he's dead." "I know," Isabel said. "But he left these behind." He discovered something, Thomas. Something terrible. About Captain Moreau. She told him everything. About the letter, the box, the journal, the map, the locket, and the message about the Raven. She told him about Moreau's treachery, about his dealings with the enemy, about his threats. Thomas listened intently, his face growing paler with each revelation. He examined the journal, the map, his brow furrowed in concentration. This is incredible, Isabel," he said finally. "And incredibly dangerous. Moreau is a powerful man. He has connections in high places." "I know," Isabel said. "But I can't just let him get away with it. Samuel, he died trying to expose him. I have to finish what he started."
But how?
Thomas asked. "You can't go to the Somme alone. It's suicide." "I have to," Isabel insisted. "The documents, they're there. I have to retrieve them." Thomas sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I understand," he said.
But you need help.
"You need someone you can trust." "I know," Isabel said. "But who?" Samuel said. He said to trust no one but the Raven. Thomas's eyes widened. He stared at her, his mouth agape. "The Raven?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes," Isabel said. "Do you know who that is?" Thomas hesitated, his gaze shifting to the window, as if checking to see if they were being watched. Then, he leaned closer to Isabel, his voice low and urgent. The Raven, he said, is a code name for a British intelligence officer.
A spy.
Operating behind enemy lines. A spy? Isabel repeated, her mind reeling. Samuel had been working with a British spy. Yes, Thomas said. And I know who it is. He was shaking now, as he looked her in the eye, fear growing in his own. I am the only one who does in this region. Besides Moreau, it would seem. Chapter 9. Dance of Shadows and Deceit. Isabel stared at Thomas, her mind struggling to process his words. Thomas, the kind, unassuming village doctor, was the only one who knew the Raven's identity. The implications were staggering. It meant that Thomas had been living a double life, secretly working for British intelligence while tending to the sick and wounded in the village. You know the Raven? She stammered, her voice filled with disbelief. Thomas nodded, his expression grave. Yes, Isabel. I've known him for many years. We've worked together on several operations. He's a good man, a brave man. But he's in extreme danger. Moreau is hunting him, and he's closing in. But why didn't Samuel tell me? Isabel asked. Why didn't he tell me about the Raven? He couldn't risk it, Thomas explained. The fewer people who knew, the better. Moreau has spies everywhere, even in this village. Isabel's heart sank. The web of deceit was far more intricate, far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. So, the documents, she said, her voice trembling slightly. The ones Samuel hid at the psalm they're meant for the Raven? Yes, Thomas replied. They contain proof of Moreau's treachery, evidence that could bring him down, and potentially expose a network of collaborators within the British military. The stakes were even higher than she had realized. This wasn't just about Samuel's death, it was about the fate of countless soldiers, about the outcome of the war itself. We have to get those documents to the Raven, Isabel said, her voice filled with a newfound determination.
But how?
The Somme is a war zone. It's impossible to get there. Not impossible, Thomas corrected. Difficult, yes. Dangerous, certainly. But not impossible. I have contacts. People who can help us. Smugglers who know the back roads, the secret paths. They can get us close to the front lines. But what about Moreau? Isabel asked. He'll be watching us. He'll be expecting us to make a move. We have to be careful, Thomas said. We have to be discreet. We have to use his own tactics against him. Deception. Misdirection. He paused, his eyes fixed on the map. This location, he said, pointing to the X marked on the psalm, it's near a ruined farmhouse. I know the place. It was used as a temporary field hospital before it was shelled. There's an old cellar beneath the farmhouse, still intact. That's likely where Samuel hid the documents. So we go there, Isabel said, her mind racing. We retrieve the documents, and we get them to the Raven. It won't be easy, Thomas warned. The area is heavily patrolled. There are snipers, landmines, booby traps. And Moreau's men will be everywhere. I'm not afraid, Isabel said, her voice firm. I'm ready to do whatever it takes. Thomas looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and concern. You're a brave woman, Isabel, he said. Brave, like Samuel. A sudden thought struck Isabel. Thomas, she said, if you know the Raven, why didn't you retrieve the documents yourself? Thomas hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. I can't, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I'm being watched. Moreau suspects me. He's been questioning me, testing me. If I make a move, he'll know. And he'll kill me. But he'll kill us too, Isabel said, her voice rising in panic. Not if we're careful, Thomas said. Not if we plan this meticulously. We have to make Moreau believe that we're not a threat, that we're just grieving relatives, trying to make sense of Samuel's death. He paused, his eyes meeting hers. We need a distraction, he said. Something to draw Moreau's attention away from us, to give us a window of opportunity. A distraction? Isabel repeated, her mind racing. What kind of distraction? Thomas's expression turned grim. We need to make Moreau believe that the documents are somewhere else, he said. Somewhere far away from the Somme. Somewhere he'll have to go to investigate.
But where?
Isabel asked. Thomas's gaze fell upon the small, wooden box that had contained Samuel's journal. An idea sparked in his eyes. The box, he said. We'll use the box. We'll plant it somewhere with a false message inside. A message that will lead Moreau on a wild goose chase. Isabel's mind raced. It was a risky plan, a dangerous gamble. But it was their only hope. Where should we plant it? She asked. Thomas thought for a moment, his eyes scanning the room. His gaze fell upon the photograph of her and Samuel, standing beneath the old oak tree. The tree, he said. We'll plant the box at the oak tree. We'll make Moreau believe that Samuel hid the documents there, after all. It was a fitting choice, a symbolic gesture. The place where their love had blossomed would now become the stage for a deadly game of deception. The rain continued to fall outside, a relentless drumming that echoed the pounding of their hearts. They had a plan. A dangerous, desperate plan. But it was their only hope of survival, their only chance to avenge Samuel's death and expose the serpent in their midst. They began to make their preparations, their movements precise and coordinated, their faces grim with determination. They were dancing with shadows, playing a game of deceit. And the stakes were higher than ever. But they were in this together, now. Chapter 10. Whispers in the Trenches. The next morning dawned gray and bleak, the rain having finally subsided, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening with a deceptive beauty. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and the ever-present, underlying odor of smoke and decay, a grim reminder of the war that raged just beyond the horizon. Isabel and Thomas set their plan in motion. They carefully prepared the wooden box, placing inside a false message, written in Samuel's handwriting, painstakingly forged by Thomas, who had a surprising talent for mimicry. The message indicated that the true documents were hidden in a small village in Switzerland, a neutral territory, far from the reach of the war. It was a plausible scenario, one that might appeal to Moreau's greed and his desire to control the information. They placed the box back in the hollow of the oak tree, making it look as if it had been hastily concealed. They scattered a few leaves and twigs around, creating the impression of a disturbed hiding place. Then they waited. They didn't have to wait long. Later that afternoon, as Isabel was tending to her small garden, she saw him. Captain Moreau, approaching her cottage, his face a mask of polite concern. Miss Hartley, he said, his voice smooth and ingratiating, I hope I'm not disturbing you. Captain Moreau, Isabel replied, forcing a calmness she didn't feel. What brings you here? I was in the neighborhood, he said, his eyes scanning her face, searching for any sign of deception. I thought I'd check on you. See how you were coping. I'm coping as well as can be expected, Isabel replied, her voice tinged with a hint of genuine grief. I understand, Moreau said. Lieutenant Hayes' death was a tragedy, a great loss to the Empire. Isabel's grip tightened on the gardening trowel she was holding. She wanted to scream at him, to accuse him of his treachery, but she knew she had to play her part. He was a good man, she said softly. Yes, Moreau agreed. A good man. And a brave soldier. He paused, his gaze shifting to the small, framed photograph of her and Samuel, which she had deliberately placed on the windowsill, in plain sight. You must miss him terribly, he said, his voice laced with a hint of sympathy. I do, Isabel replied, her voice choking with emotion. She allowed a few tears to well up in her eyes, a genuine display of grief that she hoped would add to her performance. Moreau stepped closer, his presence looming over her. I know this is difficult, he said, but I need to ask you again, Miss Hartley. Are you sure Lieutenant Hayes didn't tell you anything about his work? I told you, Isabel said, her voice trembling slightly. He didn't tell me anything. He just left me a letter, and that box. Moreau's eyes narrowed. And you're sure you haven't found anything else? He asked. Anything that might be of interest? Isabel shook her head.
No, she said.
Nothing. Moreau studied her face for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed. Very well, Miss Hartley, he said. I believe you. But if you do remember anything at all, please contact me immediately. It's a matter of national security. He turned to leave, then paused, as if struck by a sudden thought. By the way, he said, I heard you were seen at the military cemetery the other day. Visiting Lieutenant Ayes, grave. Isabel's heart skipped a beat. He knew. He was watching her every move. Yes, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I wanted to say goodbye. Moreau nodded.
Of course, he said.
And did you notice anything unusual? Anything out of place? Isabel feigned ignorance. Unusual? She repeated. No, I don't think so. Just a lot of crosses. A lot of dead soldiers. Moreau's eyes narrowed again, his gaze piercing. Nothing else? He asked. Isabel shook her head.
No, she said.
Nothing. Moreau studied her face for a moment longer, then gave a curt nod. Very well, Miss Hartley, he said. Thank you for your time. He turned and strode away, disappearing down the road. Isabel watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. She had played her part convincingly, she hoped. But she knew that Moreau was not easily fooled. Later that evening, Thomas came to her cottage, his face grim.
He took the bait, he said.
He went to the oak tree. He found the box. And the message? Isabel asked. He read it, Thomas replied. I saw him. He was agitated. He left in a hurry. Isabel felt a surge of relief, mingled with a growing sense of dread. Their plan had worked, at least for now. But Moreau would soon discover that the message was a fake. And then he would be back.
We have to go, she said.
We have to get to the Somme. Before he returns. Thomas nodded. I've made arrangements, he said. We leave at dawn. He reached into his coat and produced 2 sets of rough, peasant clothing. We will not be traveling as ourselves. The whispers of their plans were masked by the building wind outside. Chapter 11. The Price of Loyalty. Dawn broke cold and gray, a thin mist clinging to the fields, obscuring the horizon. Isabel and Thomas, dressed in their rough peasant clothing, set off on their perilous journey. They avoided the main roads, sticking to the back lanes and footpaths, their movements cautious and discreet. They looked like any other couple, traveling to market, perhaps, or visiting relatives. But beneath their unassuming exteriors, their hearts pounded with a mixture of fear and determination. Thomas had arranged for a local farmer, a man named Pierre, who was secretly sympathetic to the Allied cause, to transport them in his horse-drawn cart. Pierre was a gruff, taciturn man, but his eyes held a spark of defiance, a silent understanding of the risks they were taking. They traveled for most of the day, the cart bumping along the rutted roads, the landscape slowly changing from rolling fields to a more desolate, war-ravaged terrain. They passed through deserted villages, their houses shattered and empty, their inhabitants fled or killed. They saw the scars of war everywhere, the shell craters, the barbed wire, the abandoned trenches. As they neared the front lines, the sounds of war became more intense, the constant rumble of artillery, the occasional crackle of gunfire, the distant screams of men. The air grew thick with a stench of cordite, of mud, of death. Isabel felt a growing sense of dread, a chilling awareness of the dangers that lay ahead. But she pushed her fear aside, focusing on her mission, on her promise to Samuel. They reached a small, deserted wood, just a few miles from the front lines. Pierre stopped the cart, his face grim. This is as far as I can take you, he said, his voice low. The rest of the way, you'll have to go on foot. Isabel and Thomas climbed down from the cart, their legs stiff and aching. They thanked Pierre for his help, their voices filled with gratitude. Pierre nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and respect. Be careful, he said. The Germans, they are everywhere. He turned the cart around and drove away, disappearing into the mist. Isabel and Thomas were alone. They walked through the wood, their footsteps muffled by the damp leaves. The trees were bare and skeletal, their branches stripped bare by shellfire. The air was thick with the silence of death, a silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant sounds of war. They approached the ruined farmhouse cautiously, their senses on high alert. The building was a shell of its former self, its walls pockmarked with bullet holes, its roof partially collapsed. The surrounding area was a wasteland of mud and debris, a testament to the brutal fighting that had taken place here. "The cellar," Thomas whispered, pointing to a gaping hole in the ground, where the farmhouse's foundations had been exposed. "That's where we need to go." They moved slowly and carefully, staying low to the ground. They made their own path, skirting craters, avoiding tangles of barbed wire. They reached the cellar entrance, a dark, ominous opening that seemed to lead into the bowels of the earth. Thomas pulled out a small, battery-powered torch, its beam casting a weak, flickering light. "Stay close behind me," he whispered. They descended into the cellar, the air growing cold and damp. The smell of mildew and decay was overpowering. The cellar was small and cramped, its walls lined with crumbling shelves, its floor covered in rubble. Thomas shone the torch around the cellar, his eyes searching for any sign of Samuel's hidden documents. They found nothing, just empty shelves, broken bottles, and the remnants of the farmhouse's former life. "They're not here," Isabel whispered, her voice filled with disappointment. Thomas frowned, his brow furrowed in concentration. He examined the walls, the floor, his fingers probing for any hidden compartments, any loose stones. "They have to be here," he said, his voice determined. Samuel wouldn't have lied. He shone the torch on a section of the wall, where the mortar between the stones appeared to be loose. He pressed on one of the stones, his fingers digging into the crumbling mortar. The stone moved. A small section of the wall swung inward, revealing a hidden cavity. Isabel's heart leaped. Thomas reached into the cavity and pulled out a small, metal strongbox. It was heavy, its surface covered in rust and grime. This was it. The documents. The proof of Moreau's treachery. Suddenly, a voice rang out from above. Well, what do we have here?" Isabel and Thomas froze, their blood turning to ice. Captain Moreau stood at the entrance to the cellar, his figure silhouetted against the faint light, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He was holding a pistol, its barrel pointed directly at them. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Isabel and Thomas were trapped. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Moreau descended into the cellar, his footsteps echoing in the confined space. He approached them slowly, deliberately, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating gleam. "I must say, I'm impressed," he said. "You played your parts well, almost convincingly." He gestured to the strongbox with his pistol. "But I'm afraid your little game is over. Hand it over." Thomas stepped forward, placing himself between Isabel and Moreau. "You won't get away with this, Moreau," he said, his voice defiant. "Your treachery will be exposed." Moreau chuckled softly. "Brave words, Doctor," he said, "but utterly futile. No one will ever know what happened here. You and Miss Hartley will simply disappear. Another tragic casualty of war." He raised his pistol, his finger tightening on the trigger. Isabel closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. Suddenly, a shot rang out. But it didn't come from Moreau's pistol. Moreau gasped, his eyes widening in surprise. He staggered backward, clutching his chest. A crimson stain blossomed on his uniform. He collapsed to the ground, his pistol clattering on the floor. Isabel and Thomas stared in disbelief. Who had fired the shot? A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, lean man dressed in the tattered uniform of a British soldier. He was holding a smoking rifle, his face grim, his eyes filled with a cold fury. He was a stranger. But Isabel knew, with a certainty that sent a shiver down her spine, that she was looking at the Raven. He looked at them, a nod the only acknowledgement. "Get out.
Now."
The word was cold and sharp. Chapter 12. A stolen kiss in no man's land. Isabel and Thomas didn't hesitate. They scrambled out of the cellar, leaving Moreau's lifeless body behind, the Raven's presence a chilling reminder of the brutal realities of war. The Raven, without a word, melted back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. They ran, their lungs burning, their legs aching, not stopping until they were far away from the ruined farmhouse, far away from the scene of Moreau's death. They found themselves in a desolate stretch of no man's land, a scarred and barren landscape of craters, barbed wire, and the ghostly remnants of shattered trees. The air was thick with the stench of death, the silence broken only by the occasional distant rumble of artillery. They collapsed behind a low ridge, seeking shelter from the wind and the ever-present threat of snipers. They were exhausted, both physically and emotionally, their bodies trembling with adrenaline, their minds reeling from the events of the past few hours. He killed him, Isabel stammered, her voice filled with disbelief. The Raven, he killed Moreau. Thomas nodded, his face grim.
He had no choice, he said.
It was him or us. Isabel knew he was right, but the image of Moreau's lifeless body, the crimson stains spreading across his uniform, was seared into her memory. She had witnessed death before, but this was different. This was cold, calculated, and brutal. Who is he? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The Raven, who is he? Thomas hesitated, his gaze shifting to the desolate landscape around them. His real name is Captain Alistair Reed, he said. He's one of the best intelligence officers in the British Army. He's been operating behind enemy lines for years, gathering information, sabotaging enemy operations. But how did he know we were there? Isabel asked. How did he find us? Samuel, Thomas replied. Samuel must have contacted him, somehow. Told him about Moreau, about the documents. The Raven must have been watching us, waiting for the right moment to intervene. Isabel felt a surge of gratitude for the mysterious Captain Reed, the man who had saved their lives. But she also felt a profound sense of unease. They were still in danger. Moreau was dead, but his network of collaborators might still be active. And they still had to get the documents to safety. What do we do now? She asked. Thomas looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. We have to get out of here, he said. We have to get back to Allied lines. And we have to find a way to deliver the documents to British intelligence. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. It won't be easy, he said. But we'll do it together. Isabel nodded, her heart filled with a newfound sense of hope. She had found an ally in Thomas, a man she had once considered a simple village doctor, but who had proven to be a resourceful and courageous companion. As they sat there, huddled together in the desolate landscape of no man's land, a sudden, unexpected impulse seized Isabel. She leaned in and kissed Thomas, a brief, chaste kiss, but one filled with gratitude, with affection, with a shared sense of relief and survival. Thomas looked at her, his eyes widening in surprise. Then, a slow smile spread across his face. He returned the kiss, a gentle, tender gesture that spoke volumes in the midst of the surrounding chaos. It was a stolen moment, a fleeting connection in a world of death and destruction. A moment of humanity, of shared emotion, in a place where such things were rare and precious. They broke apart, their cheeks flushed, their hearts pounding. They didn't speak, but their eyes met, and they understood. They had found something unexpected in this desolate place, a connection forged in the crucible of danger and shared purpose. It wasn't the same as what she'd had with Samuel, but it was real. It was a comfort. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the silence. They froze, their bodies tensing, their hands reaching for the small weapons they carried. A figure emerged from the mist, a British soldier, his uniform mud-stained and tattered, his face grim and weary. Captain Reed sent me, he said, his voice low and urgent. He said you need to get to safety. He's created a diversion. The Germans are distracted. This is your chance. Isabel and Thomas exchanged a look. The Raven was still watching over them, still protecting them. Follow me, the soldier said. We have to hurry. They followed him, moving quickly and silently through the treacherous landscape, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. They were not out of danger yet, but they had a chance. A chance to escape, a chance to deliver the documents, a chance to expose the truth. As they ran, Isabel glanced back at the desolate landscape, at the place where they had shared that brief, unexpected kiss. A kiss stolen in no man's land, a symbol of hope in a world of despair. She knew their ordeal was far from over, but perhaps they could find a path to safety together. Chapter 13. The Scars That Bind Us. The journey back to Allied lines was a blur of movement and fear, a constant struggle to stay one step ahead of the enemy. The soldier, whose name they learned was Private Davies, guided them through a network of abandoned trenches, shell craters, and ruined buildings, his knowledge of the terrain proving invaluable. He was young, barely more than a boy, but his eyes held the weariness of someone who had seen too much death, too much suffering. They moved mostly at night, hiding during the day, avoiding contact with anyone, friend or foe. The sounds of war were their constant companion, the rumble of artillery, the crackle of gunfire, the screams of men. The stench of death hung heavy in the air, a grim reminder of the brutal reality they were navigating. Isabel and Thomas, despite their exhaustion and fear, pushed themselves onward, driven by a shared sense of purpose, by the need to deliver the documents, to expose the truth about Moreau and his conspiracy. They relied on each other, drawing strength from their newfound connection, their stolen kiss in no man's land a symbol of hope in a world of despair. As they traveled, they began to share their stories, their pasts, their hopes, and their fears. Isabel learned about Thomas's life before the war, his medical practice, his wife who had died of influenza a few years earlier, his quiet dedication to helping others. She saw beneath his unassuming exterior a man of deep compassion, of unwavering courage, a man scarred by loss but not broken by it. Thomas, in turn, learned more about Isabel's life with Samuel, their shared love of poetry, their dreams of a future together, a future that had been cruelly snatched away by the war. He saw her strength, her resilience, her unwavering determination to honor Samuel's memory, to finish what he had started. They talked about the Raven, about Captain Alistair Reed, the mysterious intelligence officer who had saved their lives. They speculated about his past, his motivations, his methods. They wondered if they would ever see him again. One evening, as they were huddled together in a bombed-out building, sharing a meager meal of hardtack biscuits and water, Thomas turned to Isabel, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and affection. "Isabel," he said, his voice low, "I know this isn't the time or the place, but I need to tell you something." Isabel looked at him, her heart pounding. She knew what was coming. She had seen it in his eyes, felt it in his touch. I care for you, Isabel," Thomas continued, his voice trembling slightly. "More than I ever thought possible. After losing my wife, I thought I would never feel this way again. But you've shown me that it's possible to love again, to hope again, even in the midst of all this madness." Isabel's eyes filled with tears. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "Thomas," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "I care for you too. You've been my rock, my strength. I don't know how I would have survived this without you." They sat there, holding hands, their eyes locked, their hearts connected. It was a moment of quiet intimacy, a moment of shared vulnerability, in a world of chaos and violence. "I know it's not the same," Thomas said, his voice hesitant. "I know you loved Samuel, and I would never try to replace him." "It's not the same," Isabel agreed, her voice soft. "But it's different. It's new, and it's real." They leaned in and kissed, a longer, deeper kiss this time, a kiss that spoke of shared grief, of newfound hope, of a love that was blossoming amidst the ruins of war. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, a promise of a future together, a future they would fight for, side by side. But their moment of intimacy was short-lived. A sudden burst of gunfire shattered the silence, followed by the shouts of German soldiers. They were close, too close. They sprang apart, their hearts pounding, their senses on high alert. Private Davies appeared at the entrance to the building, his face grim. "We have to move," he said urgently. "They're searching the area. They know we're here." They gathered their meager belongings and followed Davies, moving quickly and silently through the darkness, the sounds of the enemy growing closer. They were trapped, surrounded, with nowhere to run. Davies led them to a small, hidden dugout, a remnant of an old trench. It was cramped and damp, but it offered a temporary refuge. They huddled together in the darkness, listening to the shouts of the German soldiers, the sounds of their boots crunching on the ground nearby. They were searching for them, hunting them down. Isabel felt a surge of fear, a chilling realization that they might not survive this. But she looked at Thomas, at his calm, determined face, and she found strength. She would not give up. She would not let fear consume her. She reached into her coat and pulled out the strongbox, the documents that held the key to exposing Moreau's conspiracy. She clutched it tightly, her fingers tracing the cold metal. This was it. Their final stand. Their lives and their secrets were all in this small box. Chapter 14. Beyond the barbed wire. The sounds of the German soldiers grew closer, their voices harsh and guttural, their boots crunching on the rubble outside the dugout. Isabel, Thomas, and Private Davies held their breath, their bodies tense, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew that if they were discovered, they would be killed or, worse, captured and tortured for information. Davies peered out cautiously through a small crack in the dugout's entrance, his young face grim. "They're searching every building, every trench," he whispered. "They won't give up until they find us." Isabel looked at Thomas, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She knew that they couldn't stay here. They had to make a move, to try to escape, before it was too late. "We have to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We have to try to reach Allied lines." Thomas nodded, his face resolute. "I agree," he said. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to find us." Davies hesitated, his brow furrowed with concern.
"It's too risky," he said.
"The area is swarming with Germans. We'll be caught for sure." "We have no choice," Isabel insisted. "We have to try. We have to get those documents to safety." She clutched the strongbox tightly, her fingers tracing the cold metal. The documents inside represented their only hope, their only chance to expose the truth, to avenge Samuel's death, to make a difference in this brutal war. They waited until the sounds of the German soldiers had faded slightly, then crept out of the dugout, moving slowly and silently through the darkness. They stayed low to the ground, using the rubble and the shadows for cover, their senses on high alert. They navigated a maze of abandoned trenches, shell craters, and ruined buildings, the landscape a desolate testament to the horrors of war. The air was thick with the stench of death, the silence broken only by the occasional distant rumble of artillery, the crackle of gunfire. They came to a wide expanse of no man's land, a barren stretch of mud and barbed wire that separated the German and Allied lines. It was a deadly crossing, exposed to snipers, machine guns, and landmines. "We have to cross it," Thomas whispered. "It's our only way out." Davies looked at the barbed wire, his face pale.
"It's suicide," he said.
"We'll never make it." "We have to try," Isabel insisted. "We have no other choice." They waited for a lull in the fighting, then began to crawl, slowly and painstakingly, through the mud and the barbed wire. The wire tore at their clothes, their skin, drawing blood, but they pressed onward, their eyes fixed on the Allied lines in the distance. Suddenly, a flare illuminated the sky, casting a ghostly light over no man's land. They froze, their bodies pressed flat against the ground, their hearts pounding in their chests. German voices shouted, followed by a burst of machine gun fire. Bullets whizzed past them, kicking up the mud around them. They were exposed.
"Run!"
Davies shouted, his voice filled with panic. They scrambled to their feet and ran, zigzagging through the mud, trying to avoid the bullets that rained down on them. Isabel felt a sharp pain in her leg. She stumbled, falling to the ground. Thomas turned back, his face filled with concern. "Isabel," he cried. He reached her side, helping her to her feet. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I think I've been shot," Isabel gasped, her hand clutching her leg. Thomas examined her leg. A bullet had grazed her calf, tearing through her clothing and leaving a bloody wound. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was painful, and it would slow her down. "We have to keep moving," Thomas said urgently. "We can't stop now." He supported her as they continued to run, the machine gun fire intensifying. Davies, who was ahead of them, suddenly cried out. He stumbled, falling to the ground, his body riddled with bullets. He was dead. Isabel and Thomas stared in horror at the young soldier's lifeless body. They had lost their guide, their protector. They were alone, exposed and wounded, but they couldn't give up. They had to keep moving. They ran, their lungs burning, their legs aching, the bullets still whizzing past them. They were so close to Allied lines, they could see the trenches, the sandbags, the figures of British soldiers. They stumbled, and just before they reached the relative safety of the line, Isabel saw movement. Not Allied, but German uniforms.
Thomas.
She could barely cry out. It was too late. A searing pain and then nothing. Chapter 15. The Enemy Within. Isabel awoke to a world of pain and confusion. Her head throbbed, her body ached, and her senses were assaulted by a cacophony of sounds and smells. The cries of wounded men, the sharp tang of antiseptic, the pervasive odor of sweat and fear. She was lying on a cot in a crowded field hospital, surrounded by other wounded soldiers. The air was thick with the sounds of suffering, the moans, the screams, the whispered prayers. She tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through her chest, forcing her back down. She realized, with a growing sense of dread, that she had been shot again. Not just her leg, but also her chest. A nurse, her face weary and drawn, approached her cot. "You're awake," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "How are you feeling? Where am I?" Isabel stammered, her voice weak. "You're in a British field hospital," the nurse replied. "You were brought in a few hours ago. You were shot." "Thomas," Isabel said, her heart pounding with fear. "Where is Thomas?" The nurse's expression turned grave. I don't know," she said. "There were many casualties. I haven't seen him." Isabel's heart sank. Thomas. Was he alive? Was he dead? The uncertainty was unbearable. She tried to remember what had happened, but her memories were fragmented, blurred by pain and trauma. She remembered running through no man's land, the machine gun fire, Davy's death, her own injuries. And then nothing. "The strongbox," she said suddenly, her voice urgent. "The documents, where are they?" The nurse looked at her, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Strongbox? Documents? I don't know what you're talking about." Isabel's blood ran cold. The documents. Had they been lost? Had they fallen into enemy hands? She struggled to sit up again, ignoring the searing pain in her chest. "I need to see someone in charge," she said. "I need to speak to an officer." The nurse hesitated, her eyes filled with concern. "You're in no condition to talk to anyone," she said. "You need to rest." "Please," Isabel insisted, her voice pleading. "It's important. It's a matter of national security." The nurse sighed, realizing that Isabel was not going to give up. "All right," she said. "I'll see what I can do." She left, disappearing into the crowded chaos of the field hospital. Isabel lay back on the cot, her mind racing. She had to find Thomas. She had to find the documents. She had to expose Moreau's conspiracy. But how? She was weak, wounded, and alone. And she had no idea who she could trust. After what seemed like an eternity, a tall, stern-looking officer approached her cot. He introduced himself as Major Harding, a senior intelligence officer. "I understand you have some information for me," he said, his voice clipped and professional. Isabel nodded, her heart pounding. "Yes," she said. I have evidence of a conspiracy. A traitor within the British military." She told him everything. About Samuel, about Moreau, about the documents, about their perilous journey to the Somme, about the Raven, about Davy's death, about her own injuries. Major Harding listened intently, his face growing graver with each revelation. He asked her questions, probing for details, his eyes sharp and intelligent. "And these documents," he said, "where are they now?" Isabel's heart sank. "I don't know," she said. "I had them in a strongbox, but I was shot. I don't remember what happened to them." Major Harding's expression turned grim. "This is serious, Miss Hartley," he said. Very serious. If these documents have fallen into enemy hands, it could have devastating consequences. I know, Isabel said, her voice trembling. But I tried my best. We need to find those documents, Major Harding said. And we need to find her companion, Thomas? Dr. Thomas Ashworth. We need to find Dr. Ashworth, Major Harding continued. He may know what happened to the documents. He may also be in danger. He paused, his eyes meeting hers. I'm going to be honest with you, Miss Hartley, he said. There are rumors of a traitor within our ranks. A high-ranking officer involved in espionage. We've been investigating this for some time, but we haven't been able to gather enough evidence. Captain Moreau, Isabel said, her voice filled with conviction. He was the traitor. Major Harding nodded.
Moreau is dead, he said.
But his network, it may still be active. We need to find those documents, Miss Hartley. They could be the key to exposing the entire conspiracy. Isabel's mind raced. She was caught in a web of intrigue, of betrayal, of hidden enemies. She didn't know who she could trust. Even within the British military, there were those who might be working for the enemy. There's something else, Major Harding said, his voice low. The soldier who brought you in, he was found dead. A single gunshot wound to the head. Execution style. Isabel's blood ran cold. Someone had killed the soldier who had rescued her. Someone who didn't want her to talk. Someone within the British ranks. The enemy was within. Chapter 16. Crossroads of Fate. Isabel's world narrowed to the confines of the field hospital, a purgatory of pain, uncertainty, and the constant, gnawing fear that the enemy was closer than she thought. Major Harding's words, "the enemy is within," echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder of the treacherous web she was entangled in. Days blurred into nights, marked only by the changing shifts of nurses, the ebb and flow of wounded soldiers, and the agonizing wait for news of Thomas. She underwent surgery to remove the bullet from her chest, a painful and debilitating procedure that left her weak and vulnerable. She clung to the hope that Thomas was alive, that he had somehow survived the chaos in no man's land, but the lack of information was a constant torment. Major Harding visited her regularly, his face grim, his questions probing. He was a man of few words, but his eyes held a sharp intelligence, a relentless determination to uncover the truth. He told her that they were searching for Thomas, that they were investigating Moreau's network, that they were doing everything they could to find the missing documents. But Isabel sensed a growing frustration in him, a sense of desperation. Time was running out. The war was raging on, and the enemy within was still at large, potentially sabotaging the Allied effort, costing countless lives. One evening, as Isabel lay in her cot, struggling to sleep, a familiar figure approached her. It was the nurse who had first tended to her, the one with the weary face and the surprisingly gentle voice. "Miss Hartley," she said softly, "I have some news." Isabel's heart leaped with a mixture of hope and fear. "Thomas?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The nurse hesitated, her eyes filled with a complex mix of emotions. "Not exactly," she said. "But I think you should see this." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was a note, written in a familiar handwriting. Isabel recognized it instantly. It was Thomas's handwriting. She unfolded the note, her hands trembling. The message was brief, cryptic, but it filled her with a surge of hope. "Isabel, I am alive. But I cannot come to you. They're watching. Trust no one. Meet me at the crossroads. Midnight. The Raven will guide you. The crossroads. Midnight. The Raven." The words resonated with a sense of urgency, of danger, of a desperate plea for help. Isabel looked at the nurse, her eyes filled with questions. How did you get this?" she asked. The nurse hesitated again, her gaze shifting nervously around the crowded ward. "A soldier," she said. "He gave it to me. He said it was for you." "A soldier?" Isabel repeated. "What did he look like?" The nurse shook her head. I don't remember," she said. "It was dark. There were many soldiers. He just told me to give it to the woman who was shot." Isabel's mind raced. Who was the soldier? Was he a friend or a foe? Was he working for the Raven, or for the enemy within. She looked at the note again, at Thomas's familiar handwriting. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that the message was genuine. Thomas was alive.
And he needed her help.
"I have to go," she said, her voice firm. "I have to meet him." The nurse looked at her, her eyes filled with concern. "You're in no condition to go anywhere," she said. "You're still recovering from surgery." "I don't care," Isabel insisted. "I have to go.
Thomas needs me.
And I need him." The nurse sighed, realizing that Isabel was not going to be dissuaded. "All right," she said, "but be careful.
Please.
Be very careful." She helped Isabel to dress, providing her with a simple cloak to conceal her hospital gown. She gave her a small vial of laudanum to help with the pain. And she showed her a back way out of the hospital, a way that avoided the main entrance, the guards, the prying eyes. Isabel slipped out into the night, her body aching, her heart pounding. The air was cold and damp, the darkness punctuated by the distant rumble of artillery, the occasional flicker of light from a nearby camp. She made her way to the crossroads, a desolate intersection of two dirt tracks marked by a crumbling stone cross. It was a place of shadows, of secrets, of hidden dangers. She waited, her body trembling with cold and fear, her eyes scanning the darkness. She had no idea what to expect, who to trust. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, lean man dressed in the tattered uniform of a British soldier. It was the Raven, Captain Alistair Reed. He approached her cautiously, his eyes scanning the surrounding area. He was even more gaunt, more weathered than she remembered, his face etched with the lines of hardship and constant vigilance. "Isabel Hartley," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Captain Reed," Isabel replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Thomas is safe," he said, his voice reassuring. "But he's being held by the enemy within." He led her onward. The crossroads behind them, a place of uncertainty and potential doom. Chapter 17. A Revelation in the Ruins. The Raven led Isabel through a maze of back alleys and deserted buildings, moving with a silent, almost ghostly grace. He seemed to know every hidden path, every secret passage, his senses attuned to the slightest sound, the smallest movement. He was a man of shadows, a creature of the night, perfectly adapted to the dangerous world he inhabited. He didn't speak much, answering Isabel's questions with curt nods or brief, cryptic replies. He was focused, intense, his mind clearly consumed by the task at hand, rescuing Thomas and exposing the enemy within. They reached a ruined church, its walls pockmarked with bullet holes, its roof partially collapsed, its stained glass windows shattered into 1,000 fragments. It was a desolate, eerie place, a symbol of faith and hope destroyed by the ravages of war. "We're here," the Raven said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is where they're holding him." Isabel peered through a broken window, her eyes scanning the interior of the church. She saw a group of men, dressed in British uniforms, standing around a makeshift table. They were talking in hushed tones, their faces grim, their expressions intense. And then she saw him, Thomas. He was sitting in a chair, his hands bound behind his back, his face bruised and bloodied. He looked weak, exhausted, but his eyes still held a spark of defiance, a flicker of hope. Isabel's heart ached at the sight of him, at the pain he was enduring. She wanted to rush inside, to rescue him, but she knew that would be suicidal. They were outnumbered, outgunned.
Who are they?
She whispered to the Raven. Who are these men? The Raven hesitated, his gaze fixed on the scene inside the church. They are members of Moreau's network, he said. High-ranking officers, intelligence agents, men who have betrayed their country for personal gain, for ideological reasons, for reasons I still don't fully understand. But they're British soldiers, Isabel said, her voice filled with disbelief. How can they betray their own country? War does strange things to men, Miss Hartley, the Raven replied, his voice tinged with a hint of sadness. It corrupts, it deceives, it reveals the darkest aspects of human nature. He paused, his eyes meeting hers. The man in charge, he said, The man who orchestrated this entire conspiracy, it's Major Harding. Isabel's blood ran cold. Major Harding, the stern, seemingly trustworthy intelligence officer who had questioned her, who had promised to help her, who had claimed to be investigating Moreau's network. He was the enemy. He was the traitor. Harding? She repeated, her voice barely a whisper.
But he seemed so genuine.
He's a master of deception, Miss Hartley, the Raven said. He's been playing us all for fools. He used Moreau as a pawn, a scapegoat. He manipulated everyone, including me. Isabel's mind reeled. The web of deceit was far more intricate, far more insidious, than she had ever imagined. The enemy was not just within the enemy, was at the very top. We have to stop him, she said, her voice filled with a newfound determination. We have to expose him. We will, the Raven said. But we need proof. We need those documents. I don't have them, Isabel said, her voice filled with despair. I lost them when I was shot. The Raven's expression turned grim.
Then we need to find them, he said.
There are only hope. He paused, his eyes scanning the interior of the church again. They're planning something, he said. They're talking about a shipment. A delivery. Something important. He turned to Isabel, his gaze intense.
We need to get inside, he said.
We need to find out what they're planning. And we need to rescue Thomas. It was a suicide mission, a desperate gamble. But they had no other choice. The Raven outlined his plan, a daring and intricate scheme that involved stealth, deception, and a healthy dose of luck. Isabel listened intently, her heart pounding in her chest. She was afraid, terrified, but she was also determined. She would not let Harding win. She would not let Thomas down. They waited for the right moment, then slipped inside the church, moving silently through the shadows, their senses on high alert. The Raven led the way, his movements fluid and graceful, his body blending seamlessly into the darkness. Isabel followed close behind, her heart pounding, her every nerve on edge. The air was thick with tension. Suddenly, all was revealed to her. On the table was the strongbox. Chapter 18. The Heart's Reckoning. Isabel's breath caught in her throat. The strongbox. It was there, on the table in plain sight. The object of their perilous journey, the key to exposing Harding's treachery, was within reach. But it was also surrounded by enemies, by men who would kill them without hesitation. The Raven signaled for her to stay hidden, then moved silently towards the table, his body blending seamlessly into the shadows. He was a predator, stalking his prey, his movements precise and calculated. Isabel watched him, her heart pounding in her chest, her every nerve on edge. She knew that the slightest mistake, the smallest sound, could betray their presence, could lead to their capture, their deaths. The men around the table were still talking, their voices hushed, their expressions intense. They were discussing a shipment, a delivery of some kind that was scheduled to take place the following day. Isabel strained to hear their words, trying to decipher the details of their plan. She heard snatches of conversation, fragments of information that hinted at something significant, something that could change the course of the war. They were talking about a new weapon, a secret weapon that was being developed by the Germans. And they were planning to smuggle it into Allied territory. Isabel's blood ran cold. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. This wasn't just about Moreau's treachery, it was about a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of both the British and German military, a conspiracy that could tip the balance of power in favor of the enemy. The Raven reached the table, his hand hovering over the strongbox. He glanced back at Isabel, his eyes signaling for her to be ready. Suddenly, one of the men at the table looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. He had seen the Raven. "Intruder!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the church. The other men jumped to their feet, drawing their weapons. Chaos erupted. The Raven grabbed the strongbox and turned to run, but he was surrounded. He fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal, his fists and feet flying, but he was outnumbered, outgunned. Isabel knew that she had to do something. She couldn't just stand there and watch him die. She picked up a large piece of broken stained glass, its edges sharp and jagged. She rushed forward, screaming, her voice filled with a primal rage. She attacked the men closest to the Raven, slashing at them with the glass, her movements fueled by adrenaline and a desperate desire to protect the man who had saved her life, the man who was now risking his life to save Thomas. Her attack created a momentary distraction, giving the Raven a chance to break free. He grabbed her hand, pulling her with him, and they ran, dodging bullets, weaving through the chaos. They reached Thomas, who was still tied to the chair, his eyes wide with surprise and concern. The Raven quickly cut his bonds, freeing him from his captivity. "Are you all right?" Isabel asked Thomas, her voice filled with concern. Thomas nodded, his face bruised, but his eyes filled with a fierce determination. "I am now," he said. The three of them ran, their lungs burning, their legs aching, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them. They burst out of the church and into the night, the cold air stinging their faces. They didn't stop running until they were far away from the church, far away from the immediate danger. They found shelter in a bombed-out building, collapsing to the ground, their bodies exhausted, their minds reeling. They were safe for now, but they were still fugitives, hunted by a powerful and ruthless enemy. Isabel looked at the strongbox, clutched tightly in the Raven's hands. They had it. They had the proof. But their journey was far from over. They still had to get the documents to British intelligence to expose Harding and his conspiracy to prevent the secret weapon from falling into Allied hands. Thomas looked at Isabel and then at the Raven, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I suppose," he said quietly, "this makes us something of a team." "Not just a team," corrected Isabel. "A necessary evil. One to be reckoned with, I assure you," the Raven finished. His first full sentence since they'd found him. The weight of it all fell on them, the importance. But now it was 3, not 1, not 2. They had a fighting chance, but they needed to disappear. Chapter 19. Flight from the Inferno. The immediate priority was escape. They were deep in enemy territory, surrounded by hostile forces, with a powerful and ruthless enemy hunting them down. The Raven, with his intimate knowledge of the terrain and his network of contacts, took the lead, guiding them through a treacherous landscape of abandoned trenches, shell craters, and ruined villages. They moved mostly at night, hiding during the day, avoiding contact with anyone, friend or foe. The sounds of war were their constant companion, a grim reminder of the dangers that lurked around every corner. They were living on their nerves, their senses constantly on high alert, their bodies exhausted, their minds racing. Isabel, despite her injuries, kept pace with the men, her determination fueled by a fierce desire to see justice done, to avenge Samuel's death, to protect Thomas, and to expose the conspiracy that threatened to undermine the Allied war effort. The Raven, true to his name, was a master of stealth and evasion. He seemed to know every hidden path, every secret passage, every safe haven. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He was a protector, a guide, a warrior, fighting a silent war against a hidden enemy. Thomas, despite his ordeal, proved to be a resourceful and resilient companion. His medical knowledge came in handy, tending to Isabel's wounds and ensuring their survival in the harsh conditions. He also provided a calming presence, a voice of reason and hope amidst the chaos and despair. As they journeyed, they began to formulate a plan. They knew that they couldn't simply return to Allied lines. Harding's network was too pervasive, too powerful. They needed to find a way to get the documents to someone they could trust, someone outside Harding's reach. The Raven revealed that he had a contact in a neutral country, Switzerland, a high-ranking official in the British intelligence service who was secretly investigating the conspiracy. This contact, code-named Nightingale, was their best hope of exposing Harding and his network. But getting to Switzerland was a daunting task. It meant crossing enemy lines, evading patrols, navigating a war-torn landscape, and somehow managing to cross the border into neutral territory. It was a perilous journey, fraught with danger, but they had no other choice. One evening, as they were huddled together in a deserted farmhouse, sharing a meager meal of scavenged food, the Raven outlined his plan. It involved a daring and intricate scheme that relied on deception, misdirection, and a healthy dose of luck. They would split up, he explained. He would create a diversion, drawing Harding's forces away from Isabel and Thomas, giving them a chance to escape. He would then rendezvous with them at a prearranged location near the Swiss border. Isabel and Thomas would travel separately, posing as refugees, making their way towards the border, using a network of secret routes and safe houses known only to the Raven. It was a risky plan, a desperate gamble, but it was their only hope. They embraced a silent farewell, a promise to meet again, a shared understanding of the dangers that lay ahead. Then, the Raven disappeared into the night, leaving Isabel and Thomas alone, their hearts filled with a mixture of fear and determination. They set off on their separate journeys, their paths diverging, their fates uncertain. Isabel, disguised as a peasant woman, her face hidden beneath a headscarf, her injured leg throbbing with pain, moved slowly and cautiously through the war-torn landscape. She encountered countless obstacles, faced numerous dangers, but she pressed onward, her spirit unbroken, her determination unwavering. She relied on her wits, her courage, and the kindness of strangers, people who, despite the risks, offered her shelter, food, and guidance. She saw the horrors of war firsthand, the devastation, the suffering, the senseless loss of life. But she also witnessed acts of incredible bravery, of resilience, of compassion, of the enduring human spirit that refused to be extinguished by the flames of conflict. She thought of Samuel, of his gentle soul, his poetic heart, his unwavering belief in the power of love and beauty. She thought of Thomas, of his kindness, his strength, his quiet courage, his newfound love that had blossomed amidst the ruins of war. She thought about the cost. She wondered if the sacrifices would ever truly end. She kept moving, putting one foot ahead of the other. Towards freedom.
Towards safety.
Towards hope. She moved through the darkness, towards an uncertain light. Chapter 20. The Dawn After the Storm. Isabel's journey was a harrowing odyssey through a landscape scarred by war, a testament to her resilience and unwavering determination. She faced countless dangers, evading patrols, navigating treacherous terrain, and relying on the kindness of strangers who risked their lives to help her. The pain from her injuries was a constant companion, but she pushed through it, driven by the need to reach safety, to expose the truth, and to reunite with Thomas. She finally reached the prearranged rendezvous point, a small, secluded village nestled in the foothills of the Alps, just a few miles from the Swiss border. It was a place of breathtaking beauty, a stark contrast to the war-torn landscape she had left behind. The air was crisp and clean, the mountains majestic, the silence profound. She waited, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and anxiety. She had no idea if the Raven had survived, if Thomas had made it, if their plan had succeeded. Days turned into nights, and still there was no sign of them. Isabel began to lose hope, her spirit flagging, her body exhausted. She wondered if she was the only one who had made it, if she was destined to remain alone, a fugitive in a foreign land. Then, one evening, as she was sitting by a small stream, watching the sun set over the mountains, she saw him. Thomas. He was walking towards her, his face weary but his eyes filled with a radiant joy.
He was alive.
He had made it. Isabel ran to him, her heart overflowing with emotion. They embraced, a long, passionate embrace that spoke of relief, of gratitude, of a love that had endured the trials of war. I thought I'd lost you," Isabel stammered, her voice choked with tears. "I'm here," Thomas said, his voice reassuring. "I'm here, and I'm never leaving you again." They held each other, their bodies trembling, their hearts beating as one. They had survived. They had found each other. But their reunion was bittersweet. They still didn't know if the Raven had made it, if he had succeeded in creating a diversion, if he had escaped Harding's clutches. They waited, their hopes dwindling with each passing hour. Then, as darkness fell, they saw a figure emerge from the shadows, a tall, lean silhouette against the fading light. It was the Raven. He was alive, but he was injured. He had a gunshot wound to his shoulder, and his face was pale and drawn. But his eyes still held that fierce, unwavering determination, that spark of defiance that had sustained him through countless battles. "We did it," he said, his voice hoarse. "Harding is finished. His network has been exposed. The documents are safe." Isabel and Thomas rushed to his side, helping him to sit down, tending to his wounds. They learned that the Raven had managed to deliver the strongbox to Nightingale, his contact in Switzerland, just hours before Harding's forces had caught up with him. Harding, realizing that he had been exposed, had tried to flee, but he had been captured by Allied forces. His conspiracy had been unraveled, his treachery revealed. The secret weapon, thankfully, had been intercepted before it could be deployed. The Raven's actions, along with Isabel and Thomas's bravery, had saved countless lives, had potentially changed the course of the war. They spent the next few days in the village, recovering from their ordeal, tending to their wounds, and slowly coming to terms with everything that had happened. They were safe for now, but they knew that they could never truly escape the scars of war, the memories of loss and suffering. As they prepared to leave the village, to begin a new life, to build a future together, they looked back at the mountains, at the breathtaking beauty of the landscape, at the promise of peace that seemed to shimmer in the air. They had survived the inferno. They had found love amidst the ruins. They had exposed the truth, had fought for justice, had made a difference. The war was still raging, but they had found their own dawn, their own ray of hope in the darkness. They knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they were ready to face it together, their hearts bound by love, by loyalty, by the shared experience of a war that had changed them forever. Their steps now pointed toward a new beginning. A life beyond the trenches, beyond the fear. Epilogue. The war finally ended, its guns falling silent, its battlefields slowly returning to life. The world rejoiced, but the scars of conflict remained, etched deep into the hearts and minds of those who had lived through it. Isabel and Thomas settled in a small village in England, far from the ravaged landscapes of France, far from the memories of war. They built a new life together, a life filled with love, with laughter, with the quiet joys of everyday existence. Thomas returned to his medical practice, tending to the sick and wounded, his gentle hands and compassionate heart bringing comfort and healing to those in need. Isabel, her own wounds slowly healing, found solace in writing, in poetry, in capturing the beauty and the fragility of the world around her. They never forgot Samuel, the gentle poet who had been forced to become a soldier, the man whose love had set them on a path of danger and discovery. They visited his grave often, placing flowers on the freshly turned earth, whispering their gratitude, their sorrow, their enduring love. They also kept in touch with the Raven, Captain Alistair Reed, who had survived the war and continued to serve his country in the shadows, fighting a different kind of battle against a different kind of enemy. He remained a man of mystery, a figure of legend, but he was also a friend, a comrade, a reminder of the courage and the sacrifice that had been required to win the peace. Years passed, and the world slowly began to heal. But the memories of the war remained, a constant reminder of the fragility of peace, of the enduring power of love and loyalty, of the importance of fighting for truth and justice, even in the darkest of times. Isabel and Thomas had children, and then grandchildren, and they shared their stories with them, stories of courage, of resilience, of the enduring human spirit that could overcome even the most horrific of circumstances. They taught them the importance of compassion, of empathy, of standing up for what is right, even in the face of adversity. One warm summer evening, as Isabel and Thomas sat on their porch, watching the sun set over the rolling hills of England, they reflected on their lives, on the journey they had taken together, on the love that had sustained them through the darkest of times. "We were lucky," Thomas said softly, his hand reaching for hers. "Yes," Isabel agreed, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. "We were. But we also made our own luck, didn't we?" They smiled at each other, their hearts filled with a love that had endured the test of time, a love that had blossomed amidst the ruins of war, a love that would last forever. The scars remained, a reminder of the past, but they were also a testament to their strength, their resilience, their unwavering belief in the power of hope. The air was still and quiet, the world at peace. And in that peace, they found their own enduring solace, their own quiet victory. The echoes of the war would stay, but the echoes did not define them. Their love did. Their future, stretching out before them, would be their testament. The end.